Well, good evening, class, and welcome to the second lecture on public goods and common resources. This should be your second lecture that you're doing in week 8. So, learning objectives. What are public goods? What are common resources? We looked at a few examples. We did that last lecture. And then we're going to talk about how do markets deal with these? How do markets deal with this? Well, in truth, they failed because it's fine with private goods. A market where it's free, the demand and supply will basically come to an efficient equilibrium so long as there's no externalities. But with a public good common resource, either of those, basically you're going to have an indefinite amount of externalities. And so that's why the government needs to get involved. In fact, the government needs to be the one who provides public goods, or a government entity. Common resources, the government needs to regulate them. And we'll be talking about how that can be done later. How can governments improve market outcomes in the case of public goods and common resources? So, remember what we did last time. If a good is excludable, it means that a person can be prevented from using it. So, ice cream, the ice cream salesman can stop people who don't pay for the ice cream from having it. Dial-up internet, not excludable. Things like the Peshmerga, FM radios, and things that are rival in consumption, that if one person has the good, that means there's less good available for others to eat or have or consume. So ice cream would be rival, and non-rival would be something like Sami Abdul Rahman Park. If I go to the park, that's not going to diminish the opportunity for you to go to Sami Abdul Rahman Park. And we looked at a few different examples. We went through this all together, but look at the example of roads there. We've got 4 different kinds of roads, all in the four quadrants there. A road could be rival or not. It could be excludable or not. Now, most of the roads in Erbil are actually where we would probably class as a public good. Unless, of course, there starts to be traffic jams, then it becomes a common resource. I'll talk about that in a moment. So let's talk about roads now. So a road can be any of those 4 goods. It could be a natural monopoly, it could be a private good, it could be a common resource, it could be a public good. Well, how does that make sense? It depends on whether the road is congested or not. That's the first thing, because if the road is congested, meaning if there's traffic, if you go onto the road, that means the road is going to get more congested, more trafficked and more blocked up, and that's going to diminish the use of the road, even the quality of the road for other people. So suddenly it becomes rival. The moment there's a traffic jam, it becomes rival, and it moves from being it moves from right to left. It moves from being a natural resource to a private good. It moves from being a public good to a common resource. A natural monopoly to a private good, or a public good to a common resource. It moves from right to left. So rival in consumption only if congested. And is it excludable? Well, only if it is a toll road. What are the roads in Erbil? Are they excludable? No, they're not. There's nothing stopping you from driving on the road. Maybe a little bit with car registrations and things, but you could drive a motorbike and not have a registration here, so it's not really excludable. But if it was a toll road, this is a road that you pay to get onto the road and you pay to use the road. Well, suddenly it's excludable. You're stopping people from using the road who don't pay. And it's not very common in the Middle East, but a place with a lot of private enterprise, a place like the USA, they have toll roads going all through the country, and there are gates that you need to go through in order, just like a Nuqtat Teftish, they're checkpoints you've got to go through in order to get on the motorway, and you have to pay a fee to get on the road. So suddenly it's excludable. So if something is rival and excludable, meaning it's a congested toll road, it's a private good. If it is excludable but it is not congested, that means it's a natural monopoly, meaning that the company or the agency that owns the road, they don't really have any competition. No one else is going to build a road because there's no incentive to go in competition with you, because there's no limit on the number of people who could use your road at this stage. The public good, well, that would be if it's not congested and it's not excludable. But the moment that public good becomes congested, if there's no toll road, if there's no gates excluding people from going on the road, then it's a common resource. It's just like fish in the ocean. The more people who use the motorway, the less motorway there is available for others to use, because it's basically congesting the road. So 4 possibilities. Uncongested, non-toll road, that's a public good. That is not rival and it's not excludable. Uncongested toll road, well, that's excludable but it's not rival, that's a natural monopoly. And a congested non-toll road, well, that's rival but not excludable, that's a common resource. And a congested toll road, that is both rival, both excludable, that's a private good. And free markets only work with private goods. If you have public goods, natural monopolies, common resources, you're not going to be able to get a supply and demand curve coming to an efficient outcome. So that's why governments need to get involved for the top 3 of those 4. So there's different kinds of goods. We've talked about private goods, we've talked about natural monopolies, we've talked about common resources and public goods. What we're going to focus now on is public goods and common resources. The reason for that is, as a civil engineer, much of the infrastructure that you will be building will be focused on this, public good and common resource. So, and the reason for that is basically these goods are not excludable. So basically no private companies are not going to get involved in building these goods, because why would you build something where people can use it without paying? There's no incentive to pay. And so basically you need to make it free to everyone to use, with regulation maybe, and then from that you're basically making all of the benefit external. All of the value is in an externality because there is no price attached to it. Private decisions about consumption and production, they lead to an inefficient outcome. That's why the public government needs to get involved to produce these kinds of infrastructure to raise the economic well-being of cities and economies. If they weren't done, if you just leave it to the free market, then these roads would never be built. These bridges and dams and wastewater treatment facilities, they wouldn't be built, and basically all of the external benefits of those things would not be realized. No one would want to live in Erbil because it would be a despot, and it would be an anarchy state. It wouldn't be a fun place to live, and basically there would be a lot of external costs associated with not carrying out these public good and common resource infrastructures. So let's look at public goods now. The big issue with private markets, if a private market was to build a public good, is a problem called the free rider problem. Let's say the government didn't want to build a 150-meter road. They said, we just don't have the money for it. Why doesn't a private company build it for themselves, and they can charge people for it? Well, let's say a big company, I don't know, Sarabast Enterprises, let's say, they say, okay, we'll build a 150-meter road, and we will tell everyone, every time you drive on the road, you need to send in $5 to, there's going to be a $5 toll to our office. Well, the trouble is there's no gates on a 150-meter road. They can't exclude people. So there's no incentive for me to pay the toll if I go on the road. I can ride on the road by paying the fee, or I can just be a free rider. I can not pay, and there's no fine, there's no comeback on me. And everyone thinks that, and so no one pays. And if there are a few who pay, they have to pay a lot more to cover all of the people who aren't paying. That's called the free rider problem. There's no incentive to pay. A person who receives the benefit of the good but avoids paying for it is called a free rider. It's just an example would be right now. I'm actually using Dr. Dara's Wi-Fi because I found his password. He lives in the apartment below me. I'm not paying for that. I have no incentive to pay for internet myself because I can get internet for free. I'm a free rider. Don't tell Dr. Dara that. He doesn't know. So if goods are not excludable, everyone has the incentive to be a free rider because firms cannot prevent non-payers from consuming the good. That's why you need to have a good password on your internet and not just your birthday. The result is that no good is produced because basically no one's going to build the road if they can't make a profit from it, if it's treated as a private good. And even if buyers collectively value the good higher than the cost of providing it, meaning that you have a market failure. That's why the government needs to step in with public goods. So if the benefit of the public good exceeds the cost of providing it, and remember, we're talking about value and utils here, not necessarily money. The government should provide the good and pay for it with a tax on people who benefit. So one problem is it's difficult to measure the benefit. That's usually a difficult thing. Trying to value external benefits and external costs is very challenging, but you make an attempt at doing that with something called a cost-benefit analysis. We're going to talk more about this when we do project management together in UG4. A cost-benefit analysis, it's very imprecise because it's very hard to put values on external benefits and external costs when there's been no transaction. But there's a few different ways you can go about doing it. But by doing that, you can basically determine if a project, a public good project, is of net benefit to society. Do the benefits outweigh the cost? And if so, you should think about doing this project. So that's why the government pays for motorways in Erbil. They do a cost-benefit analysis and they think this is actually going to be good for the economy. It's going to be good for everyone in Erbil. The city is growing to the north. We should probably build this 150-meter road up towards Baraka. What do you say? And then they will start building it. And even though the people themselves will not be paying for it directly, the people who use it, usually they will pay for it with a tax. Although, because Kurdistan is a rentier state, meaning it doesn't get the government doesn't get its revenue from taxes, but it actually gets it from oil. You've got to remember that basically, if they didn't get their money from oil, basically the private enterprise, they would be running the oil fields and the government would be charging tax. So in a way, we are all being taxed, just indirectly, because basically the government is not taking our money, they're taking our oil, our common resource, if you will. And if they control that, then they don't need to tax us. So that's how Kurdistan works. It's called a rentier state, if anyone's interested. So some important public goods: national defense, Peshmerga. Knowledge created through basic research. I can tell you now that nearly all of the research that we do at a university, it is very basic level research where we're not trying to make business plans. We're not trying to find ways to turn profits. So private companies are never going to pay for our research. Even though they will in the long term benefit from our research, in the short term they will not, and therefore governments and UN institutions, they fund our research. What's happening here? Is that not working? Oh yeah, fighting poverty. Again, who are the beneficiaries of those fighting poverty? It's those who are living in poverty. Can they pay for that service? No, they can't. But it's a public good. Everyone benefits. So a common resource, remember, a common resource is like a public good in that it is not excludable, but it is different from a public good in that it is rival, meaning that the more I use a common resource, the less common resource there will be available for everyone else. So a typical a common resource could be the reservoir of oil under Kirkuk. Right now, there are oil fields that pump oil out of that reservoir in both the KRG and Baghdad, on both sides of the border where it now stands. Now, if the KRG start harvesting more oil, that means there's going to be less oil for the south of Iraq to harvest. That's a common resource, by the way. Neither of the two countries are excluded from taking the oil from the reservoir. It's not like there's a fence that goes down the middle of the reservoir. So if you take from one end of the reservoir, you're sucking oil out from underneath the other country. And so it's not excludable, but it's rival. If you use the oil, that means there's less oil available for the other guy. So just like a public good, you cannot prevent free riders from using common resources because it's not excludable. And there's little incentive for firms to provide. So an example of a common resource would be, I don't know, fish in the Zab River. Now, is there ever going to be a firm that says we want to be selling people fish and we're going to put our fish in the Zab River? Well, of course not, because basically other people can fish and catch the fish that the firm put in there. It's a common resource. It's not excludable. And so there's no incentive to try and improve fish stocks in the rivers of Kurdistan, not in the free market anyway. And so that's where the government needs to step in, and they need to do their cost-benefit analysis, and they need to provide that common resource, or potentially regulate the common resource that's already there. So as well as this, there are additional problems with common resources in that they are rival. So if basically you can't stop anyone from using the resource, it's not excludable. But in addition to that problem, common resources are rival, meaning that the if the KRG is pumping out oil from the Kirkuk reservoir, that means there's going to be less oil available for everyone else. So what's that going to lead to? It's going to lead to overuse. You're going to drain the oil out. So that's where the government needs to step in. And it's difficult when it goes across countries because governments need to come to terms of agreement. And this is one of the big issues with the river, for example. We talked about this, the Euphrates River that runs through Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, how different countries are using the water, but basically it's being used in an inefficient manner because none of the three countries can come to an agreement. It's pretty hard to get Middle Easterners agreeing at the best of times. That's why it's quite an unstable region. But getting them to agree on water distribution, that's a real tough thing. So this is called the tragedy of the commons. And so to explain the tragedy of the commons, I'm going to tell you a story. A parable that means story, but it's a story with a moral. It's got a lesson behind the story. That's what a parable is. So let's say there's a medieval town. Let's imagine we're in Erbil in 1000 AD, let's say. And Erbil back then was just the citadel. There was nothing else there. We all lived in the citadel. And below the citadel, we just had open wilderness. And it was grazing land. It was all grass. And we used to put our sheep down there in the public common land, which we called the town common, and sheep would graze and eat the grass. And whenever we wanted to slaughter one of our sheep, we would go down and take one of our sheep and eat it. That situation right there is basically a public good. The public good is the public land, and it was called the town common. But as the population of Erbil grows, so does the number of sheep. Suddenly there's less grass around because the sheep are eating all of the grass. The amount of land is fixed. The sheep can't go too far from the citadel, so they can only graze maybe a 5-kilometer radius from the citadel, so that amount of land is fixed. And the grass begins to disappear because of overgrazing. Now, the private incentives using the land for free outweighs the social incentives using it carefully. So what happens? Gradually, the land around Erbil turns to a desert, and then no one has sheep and everyone starves. And I can tell you that that has actually happened in the history of Erbil. You can see the population of Erbil, if you study the anthropology and the archaeology of Erbil, the population went up and down and up and down in waves. And most people actually put it to the tragedy of commons. As the population grew, there was overgrazing and the land turned to a desert, and then people starved. And then when the population was small again, the grass would grow back and they would graze it, and then more people would graze it, the population would grow, it would get overgrazed and it would turn to desert, the people would starve to death, and the population would drop. And the population went up and down in a wave pattern for many hundreds of years in Erbil. And this is because of the tragedy of the commons. The result is people can no longer raise sheep and feed themselves. So, what caused this grand tragedy? Well, it is because the social and private incentives differed. Now, no single family in Erbil had any incentive for themselves to reduce the size of its flock, because they said, look, if we eat, it's not like we're going to make any difference anyway if we reduce our sheep. We're just one small family, and why should we have to reduce the size of our flock? Why not everyone else? So they don't. And this is basically an externality. The benefit of having smaller flock sizes would be that the land would not be overgrazed, and so that the land will not turn to a desert. Allowing one's flock to graze on the common land reduces the quality for other families. So that's the external cost against the internal benefit. And so people don't take account of the external cost, because it's basically acting like a free market. And so the end result is people overuse the land. Is this making sense? So how do we control common resources? Well, there's a couple of different policy options. What can the townspeople do, or their government, the sheikh or the Imam of Erbil, what can they do to prevent the tragedy? Well, there's a couple of different options here. Have a think. Okay, the first thing they could do is they could regulate the number of sheep per family. The government, or the king of Erbil, can bring out a royal decree and say every family shall have no more than 10 sheep, every household. If anyone has more than 10 sheep, they're breaking the law. I will cut off their fingers, or something like that. So basically, by regulating, just like we learnt about with externalities, you're basically internalizing the externality. You've determined what is the quantity of sheep that can graze the land at the social optimum, and then you've said, okay, well, if the social optimum is 1,000 sheep and we've got 100 households here in Erbil, each household can have no more than 10 sheep. You've internalized the externality by regulation. Another way you can internalize the externality is by taxing the sheep. Basically, you tell people, okay, for every sheep grazing the town common, you will pay a tax of 50,000 dinar a year, or something like that. And suddenly, a lot less people are going to be grazing sheep. It's going to bring the demand curve down towards the marginal social benefit curve, and it's going to reduce the quantity of sheep that are grazing. Or you could auction off limited numbers of sheep grazing permits. So rather than regulating and saying every family can have 10 sheep per family, you can say, okay, there can be 1,000 sheep. We can auction off, meaning that you're letting the free market determine the price, the permits for each head of sheep that can graze on the land. And this way you're also controlling the quantity of sheep that are on the land, because you can't have non-permitted sheep on the town common. Or what you can do is you can divide the land up, put fences around everything, create borders, and make little land plots, or arth in Arabic, and you're basically then selling the land to individual families, and you're making it a private good. Suddenly, all of the sheep that you own, you can only graze them on your land, the land that you own, and no one else can graze your sheep on your land. And so now, because of the fences, the good is excludable. And so it turns from being a common resource into a private good. So those are different ways that the government can control the use of land. And so basically the way the whole world is going, more or less, especially in urban environments, is they're moving towards private goods. Most of the land in cities is being sold to individuals who then can sell the land on to other people, and it's a private good. The only country which is sort of going against that direction is, well, there's a couple of countries. There's China and there's North Korea. Those are both communist countries, and because of their political idealism, they don't actually believe in private land for the most part. And the other country is Mongolia. They're working a different way. They're basically trying to auction off permits and trying to tax and trying to regulate. That's how Mongolia is trying to work things at the moment. But that's because Mongolia is a very poor country, and if they tried to sell land, they just wouldn't get any money for it because the people are so poor. So it's easier to get money to run the government by taxing. That's why they do it. Most other countries, including Kurdistan, are moving towards the fifth option in terms of land anyway. But for other common resources, they may use regulation or taxing or a system of auctioning permits. So, some important common resources: clean air and water. Of course, if I'm using all of the clean water from the Zab River, that means there's less clean water available for other people. Congested roads. Another car on the road making it more congested will reduce the quality of the road for others. Fish, whales and wildlife. It is not legal to hunt in Kurdistan for rabbits or for snow leopards or for anything, I think, other than wild pigs. That's my understanding. That's the regulation of a common resource. They're trying to protect the common resource for others. So, some importance that, in conclusion, I think we need to talk about the importance of property rights. We've looked at some goods that basically a free market cannot come to a socially optimum outcome. In terms of a socially optimum price and quality, the free market basically just cannot provide, because with public goods they are both non-rival and non-excludable. Common resources, they are rival but not excludable, and it's the fact that they are not excludable that means that private companies are not willing to provide these goods. And because of that, they don't get provided because the private companies say, what about the free riders? And therefore, the government needs to get in. And why I'm really teaching this to you as civil engineers are the infrastructure that the civil engineer works on: bridges, motorways, pipelines, sewage systems, dams. These are all public goods or common resources. So generally, if it's left to the free market, public goods tend to be underprovided and common resources tend to be overconsumed. So the common theme here is that the market fails to allocate the resources efficiently because the property rights are not well established. What do I mean by property rights? Well, it means that basically there's no ownership. That's what I mean. You have no right to own a piece of the common resource or the public good. Therefore, for something like air, no one owns the air, so no one has an incentive or much incentive to not pollute the air. The end result is the air gets far too polluted. Nobody can charge people who benefit from the national defence. the end result is there's little defense. No one pays for it, and so the defense disappears. And so, yeah, we have an example there of basically public goods where there's no property rights, and because of that, the resources do not reach an efficient equilibrium under a free market. So the importance of property rights: when you can't have property rights, basically you have a market failure, and so governments need to step in to solve the problem. So so here's some examples here. Pollution permits. No one has an incentive not to pollute the atmosphere, or very little, because it's not like it's my atmosphere, and if I don't pollute it, someone else will. Well, the government can step in and start offering pollution permits. So you could start having, you could start selling the permits to put so many tons of CO2 into the air. The trouble with this, though, is that with air pollution, it's not only a national problem, it's an international problem. So you need to get all the countries to agree. And so it's a very difficult thing to do. And the work of the UN and the Climate Change Framework Agreement, the Paris Accord, if you've ever heard of that, this was an attempt to do this. But currently, America and Canada have not agreed to the permit. They've to a permit system internationally. They won't agree to it. And other countries, many of them are Middle Eastern countries, have agreed to it, but in actual honesty, they're not following the Paris Accord. Restricting the hunting seasons, so saying, okay, you can hunt deer and antelope in the months of spring. In the months of, I don't know, March and April, but all other months you're not allowed to hunt deer. Therefore, you're basically protecting the common resource. National defense: tax people, gather the money, use that to pay for a national defense, to pay for the Peshmerga. It's actually far more efficient than everyone having their own personal bodyguards, because it's you've basically got scales of economy. More on that next week, I hope. And a good, well-planned and implemented policy can improve the allocation of resources and raise the economic well-being of the entire society. Well, guys, that's all we have for public goods and common resources. I want to encourage you, remember to read Alan Anderton's book chapter on public goods. You don't need to get this from the library, don't worry. I've photocopied the chapter and it's on Moodle. It's a very good chapter. I really recommend you read it. It explains public goods far better than I can. I also want to add that there is a video from Crash Course in Economics. I don't know if that's been useful for you, but I thought it was a fairly useful 10-minute video. So please watch that as well. Guys, if you've got any questions about public goods, common resources, remember this is the focus of assignment 6 for you. If you've got any questions, let me know in the Zoom tutorial or contact me by email or phone call. Thank you and God bless.